So you just got your Sony ZV E10 II. You go to take your first photo and we've all been there. Let's get you all set up because this camera is producing some pretty impressive results. The first thing that's going to make the quality of your photos really good with this camera is going to be making sure that everything is nice and sharp and in focus. The first setting we're going to look at when it comes to focus, we're going to scroll down to this AM/MF tab. On number 1, we're going to go to focus mode. There's a few options here. I like keeping the camera in continuous autofocus. That just means that it's going to be whether the subject is getting further or closer to the camera or side to side, it's going to keep tracking it as opposed to something like automatic focus where the camera is going to be guessing if it's going to be choosing between continuous or single shot, meaning once it's got its focus and then maybe the subject moves, it's not going to move the focal point until you refocus. I think for most people, keeping it in continuous autofocus is going to increase the odds of getting things in focus. And now because the camera's in continuous autofocus, we can utilize touch tracking really well. So down here at the very bottom, this yellow tab, I'm going to scroll to number 5, which is touch operation. Just make sure that touch operation is set to on. And now when you tap a subject on the back of the camera, it's going to track that subject for you to be able to focus on. And to get focus with this camera, all you have to do is just half hold the shutter button. That's going to tell it to grab focus. It'll turn green around what it's focusing on, and then you can snap your shot. Another interesting focus setting on this camera, on this first tab here, so the number 1 AF/MF, we're going to scroll to AF level for crossing. I think this comes out of box in standard. I changed this to lock on, and essentially what that means is that if you focus on a subject and a different subject crosses in front of them, that it's going to stay locked on to the original subject that you had in focus. Having it set on to something like standard or responsive just means that it might grab the subject that's crossing in front a little bit faster. When it's locked on, it's going to stay on that original subject for a lot longer. And still on this AF/MF tab here, we're going to go to number 2 on focus area. I'm going to select focus area, and this is going to be determining the actual focus area that the sensor is using to get focus. So when it's in wide, that just means it's using the entire screen to focus on something or to find a focal point. You can refine that a little bit. Like if I go to zone, I can just move what actual within that white box that the camera is utilizing to get focus. So it's only going to grab focus inside of that white box. We can also go to center, which is going to simply just focus on the center of the frame. You have this movable spot, and you can change that from huge to large to medium to small. And then once you select that, you can just move the focus point around or really dial in maybe exactly where you want something to focus. That same white box, in this case, just a little bit smaller. Expand spot is the same thing, except for you get 2 options here. When you get that center little square there, it's going to focus inside that, but you also get a little bit more range just slightly outside. That's probably one of my favorite settings, and all those are going to have their benefits. I'll talk a little bit deeper about what situations I might use different focus areas for in just a second. The next key setting to get the most out of your ZV E10 II for high quality photos is going to be choosing between auto mode versus manual mode. So in the camera, under this first tab here, we're simply just going to have this shooting mode option. Down here under shoot mode, I'm under manual right now, but this is where you can actually change, and it's going to come out of box in what's called intelligent auto. I'll probably just refer to that as auto for the rest of today's video, but you have auto and then you have manual right here is what that M stands for. So there's a few pros and cons we need to talk about with this. The downside to using auto is that you might not get the exact photo that you want. It might be a little bit too dark or a little bit too bright, or it might not be perfectly sharp even if you get things in focus. That's not to say that you can't get really good images with an auto setting. I mean, this shot was taken in auto mode, but some of those downsides that we just talked about are certainly a factor when it comes to auto. The benefit to auto is pretty obvious in that you can pick it up and the camera is going to be making all the decisions for you. It's pretty user-friendly. You can just point and shoot and usually get a pretty good result. Most of what we talk about in today's video is going to benefit you even if you're shooting in auto, although you might notice notice that some of the menu options are going to be grayed out when you're in auto because those exact menu options are only unlocked when you're in manual. And I get it when you're first starting out about how valuable auto can be, but at some point I do encourage you to take off the training wheels and jump into manual. It's not as scary as you might think. And the benefits of being in manual mode is you have complete control over every single setting in the camera. I'll show you in a minute how I've customized a lot of buttons and dials on the camera to get the most efficiency when you're in manual mode. Everything you see on my YouTube channel, the photos with this camera, the videos, the editing, is self-taught. Everything. And I wouldn't be able to do that without platforms like Skillshare, who are the sponsor of today's video. I can't recommend exploring classes like what are on Skillshare enough. It's exactly what I did when I was first starting out and still do to this day to level up with my camera. There are a ton of courses on photography, and I remember learning so many things about camera basics and editing when I was first starting out. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. Skillshare can help you take your hobbies, your career, your passions, your side hustles to new heights. The one and only MKBHD, who has a massive YouTube channel, has a really good course about success on YouTube, and Ali Abdal has a really good one on productivity with Notion. Really cool stuff, and the first 500 people who use my link in the description are going to get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. The camera's going to come defaulted. We're on this first tab here, this red one, and on number 1, image quality. The camera's going to come defaulted on this file format. It's going to be in JPEG. I switched this over to RAW, and the RAW file type that I choose is this lossless compressed option. A RAW file type is going to be a lot larger of a file size versus JPEG. The benefit to that, when you're in post, you're going to be able to push the exposure and the colors and the tones really far with the RAW photo without losing any quality or having it break down. With the JPEG image, when you get it into post and you try to push the colors or push the exposure, it's not going to have as much latitude to do that before the image starts to fall apart a little bit. A simple rule of thumb is if you're planning on editing your photos, I'd suggest using RAW. If you're not planning on editing them, JPEG usually works really good. Regardless of JPEG versus RAW, you're going to need to make sure that you get your exposure and your white balance right if you want them to look good, which we will talk about toward the end of the video. Editor Sean here. I just realized I forgot to mention, in this camera, you want to make sure that your aspect ratio is set to this setting, this 3:2 setting. I think it comes out of box in 16:9. And 16:9 is not going to allow you to use the entire sensor for your photos. It's going to just kind of crop the top and bottom in a little bit, but 3:2 using the entire sensor. So now you have more room to crop in post. Number 4, creative looks and picture profiles. First, when it comes to picture profiles, if you scroll down to this pinkish purple tab here, the exposure and color, and we're going to go down to color and tone number 6. And then if I go to picture profile, this is where we can choose different picture profiles in the camera. Picture profiles are typically used for video. I don't really know anybody who uses them for photography, but I have noticed a lot of you leaving comments on the channel about photography and whether or not you should use picture profiles. Generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend using picture profiles for photography. But when it comes to creative looks, that's a little bit of a different topic. So just going up one tab here for creative look, the camera's going to have a bunch of internal different creative looks that we can utilize. And look, like these can be helpful if you want to if you like one of the looks that the camera is being able to produce, whether it's some of those blue tones or those green tones or those black and white. One of the issues I think with that is that everybody has access to those same creative looks. If you really want to stylize your images, I can't emphasize this enough. I think you need to accept the challenge of getting good at editing and post-production with your photos. That flexibility is going to allow you to get the right look and the right feel for a different shot regardless of the scene instead of using these creative looks. I keep the camera in the standard creative look, which that just means no creative look. Quick settings for different types of shots. So I will provide this checklist. There's a free link down below. You can check this out if you want a quick guide here for the quick settings that I would recommend for a portrait or a landscape or a product or an action type of shot. But let's look at some quick rules of thumb when it comes to those and in-camera settings. So for a product style shot, I'm going to be at least f5.6 for the aperture. That's going to help ensure that almost everything of that product is going to be in focus. And when I say at least f5.6, that means I'll rarely be below 5.6 and usually even a little bit above that depending on the lighting, but at least f5.6. On that note, a ton of light is very helpful when it comes to getting a good product shot. And the ISO range that I'll be in for a product shot is usually 160 up to about 3200. That's about the max that I'll put this camera in to have a good quality. Much above that, I found we're introducing a little too much noise and kind of softening the image up a little bit. And I usually, for almost all my photos, don't go below 160 for ISO. It does go lower on this 100 number here, but I typically don't go below 160. Tend to like how that looks a lot, but a little bit of preference there. But for me, 160 to 3200 for the ISO to get the exposure that I need for that product. And then for my shutter speed, if I'm hand holding, I'll have that at least 1/100. It'll help me if I'm moving around a little bit so that it doesn't make it a blurry image. It's going to freeze it enough. So 1/100 if I'm handheld. If I'm locked off on a tripod, I'll let that go as 1/50, which will still help me maintain a nice and sharp image. And the focus type that I'll use for that product shot is going to be wide, so I'll keep the camera in wide and I'll just tap the back of the screen on the subject to get my focus. For a portrait style shot, I'm going to go as low on the f-stop as my lens allows. That's going to be what creates that nice blurry background and separation from the subject. Anywhere between 1.4 and f2.8 can be a good option, but typically just get that as low as your lens allows. And my ISO range is going to be the same for all these types of shots, which is going to be 160 up to about 3200, and we'll just be using that to get the right exposure. Same thing for portraits. If I'm handheld, at least 1/100 for my shutter speed, never lower than that. If I'm locked off on a tripod, I will use 1/50 so long as the person I'm taking a picture of isn't moving. And the focus type that I'll use for a portrait is going to be this expand spot. I'm just going to move that right on the subject's face, and then it's gonna override that and it's gonna be able to focus on their eye, which is what you want for a good portrait. For a landscape style shot, my aperture, I'll usually have that at least f8. I will go lower if it's like really low light, and because usually landscapes, you're shooting something that's pretty far away from the camera, like all the subjects are pretty far away. So even if you're at a lower aperture for like a lower light situation, even at 1.4, everything will still be in focus as long as it's pretty far away, but I will typically have that around f8 to make sure everything's in focus. Usually landscapes are pretty bright as well, so anything from f8 to going much higher to help darken the image if I need to can be really good. ISO range, you guessed it, 160 to 3200 depending upon the exposure that I need. My shutter will be the same as it's been. That shutter speed really does help to make sure that your images are nice and crisp and sharp, assuming that they're in focus. Focus mode for landscape, I'll typically be in wide. I'll tap the back of the screen on the subject of the shot, which for a landscape is usually just the horizon. Then I'll half hold the shutter button to get the focus and fire away. For an action style shot, things are going to be a little bit different here. The first thing is that my aperture, it's really going to depend. If I want a lot of separation off the background, kind of like a portrait shot, like a lot of blur, might put that really low, might have it a little bit higher to help me out with some of the exposure potentially, but that's going to be a pretty big range for an action style shot. To be safe, I might put it around f4, because I know that I'm not going to have, if it's down to like 1.4, I have to get my focus just right. F4 gives me a little bit more of a cushion to miss my focus like slightly and still have the right subject be in focus with still having a decent enough separation off the background at f4. ISO range, shutter speed is one of the biggest differences here. I'll never have, for an action style shot, usually things are moving pretty fast. I'll never have it below 1/250. That's going to help me really freeze motion. But that's really only going to be applicable for a subject that's moving at a similar speed that someone would walk. 1/250 will freeze that motion. I'll go to 1/500 if the subject's moving even quicker. And for even faster moving subjects like cars or like birds in flight, I'm going to go to like 1/2000, although it might even go as high as 1/4000 to make sure that I freeze the image and get a really sharp shot. I'm going to keep it in wide mode for the focus. I'm going to tap the subject to track it. It's going to be moving quickly, so that touch tracking is pretty valuable here. The other setting for an action shot, I'm going to go to this first tab here. We're going to scroll down to number 5 for drive mode. I want to put that in continuous shooting on high plus. That's going to give the camera the ability to grab rapid fire photos as fast as it can to capture a lot of shots. Then we got to go into editing and pick the best one. But either way, that's going to help us increase the odds of getting the perfect shot. So why did you get the ZV E10 Mark II? Or why are you thinking about picking one up? It's a fantastic camera, but let me know in the comments down below, as well as any questions you might have. And while you're down there, give this video a tap on the thumbs up to let me know to keep making videos just like this one. Number 6, custom buttons. This is how you're really going to personalize your camera and make it really efficient. I'm going to show you how to map those, and then you can just copy all my settings if you want to set yours up just like mine. First thing, under the menu, we're going to go back down to the very bottom here, this yellow tab. Number 3, Operation Customize. There's 2 options here. This one's for video and this one's for photo. So the top one here, Custom Key Dial Settings. And now we have a bunch of tabs to be able to customize. I'll share with you. Again, you can just copy mine, but here's how you map them first. Yours are going to look a lot different when you get to this tab. I've changed all of mine. What's going to happen here, first off, it's going to highlight the actual button on the camera that you're going to be adjusting. So this first one here, in this case, it's the trash can on the camera. That's a customizable button. You can click it and then you can scroll through the menu and choose the thing that you want to map that button to. Here's what I have mine mapped to. This is going to be focus standard. So for me, when I click that button, make sure I'm in a focus mode that actually makes a difference. Why this is valuable, I'm going to choose expand spot. So that expand spot is stuck right there. When I click my focus standard button, for me, I've mapped that to the trash can. I click that and now I can move that around really quickly. Next, I have my zebra display select. That's going to turn my, we'll talk a lot about zebras in a second. That's going to turn my zebras on. That's an exposure tool that can be really helpful. That's just going to simply turn them on. And then when I tap left, that's going to allow me to choose the levels at which they show up. Number 4 here for white balance, I just toggle to the right on that wheel, and that brings up all of my white balance settings that I can toggle through. Next, when I push down on my wheel, that's going to bring up my focus area, and that allows me to toggle between the different focus settings that we talked about earlier. Next tab here, number 2, we'll talk about that first, the red button on the top of the camera. I think it comes out of box is like start movie recording. It's the last thing I want to bump when I'm taking photos, that it starts recording a video. So I just keep that as not set. And then my drive mode is my number 1, my C1 button, and that just allows me to change between single shooting or those continuous options, or like a self timer, just quick access to that. That being something I tend to toggle around pretty frequently with. This one here, if your lens has a customizable button, you can map something there. I have a variety of lenses that have customizable buttons and some that don't, so I just keep that as not set to eliminate any confusion. This is one of the biggest pieces for me, this 4th tab here, your wheels. I have my top one set to aperture and my actual wheel here set to ISO. So the actual, when I'm back in the camera here, when I spin that top wheel, that quickly changes my aperture, and when I spin this wheel down here that we just looked at, that's what's going to rapidly change my ISO. Those 2 things, when I'm in manual mode, being frequently adjusted, I have just some quick settings to be able to do that. Shutter speed, I can't map that. I chose not to map shutter speed to one of those dials. Nice thing with this camera is you can just tap the back of the screen on shutter and just automatically pull up the adjustments for that setting. Next piece of customization, if we just go under that same tab, we're going to go to function menu settings. Top brackets up here, this is for function menu. Down here is for video. Same thing, you would just click on it and map the thing that you want. I tend to have not a lot of options here. Like, I try to eliminate the noise, and because this camera has so many options on the touch screen, I do have some redundancy. Some things that are able to be changed via touch on the screen, I have them hard mapped to certain buttons. Kind of a preference thing there. but I tend to leave a lot of these as not set because I want to eliminate the noise of how many options are out there. So what that is, when I hit the function button on the actual camera, it pulls up those settings that we were just looking at. The blank squares are because it's not set. On here, I have my focus mode I can quickly change, although I typically almost always have this camera in continuous autofocus. My file format if I want to play around between RAW and JPEG, and then the target recognition, almost always on human, but you can change that between different type of animals as well. Interval shooting, that's what you want to use if you want to create time lapses. I have white balance here again because I tend to forget that I custom map that, so redundancy there. And then silent mode, the camera, when this is on and you take a picture, it doesn't have an actual mechanical shutter. The sound that you're hearing when you take a picture with this camera is just a little speaker that's making it sound like a shutter, but you can turn that speaker off if you're at like an event or something where you don't want to hear the camera. You can just set it to silent mode and then the camera's not going to make that sound. Number 7 is exposure and white balance. 99% of what's going to make your photos look good, assuming that it's in focus, which isn't an issue for you anymore, you sexy. That's going to come back to the photo being exposed well with proper white balance. Whether you're in manual or auto, we all know that having a photo that's way too bright or way too dark isn't going to be ideal. And that all just comes back to exposure. And although it isn't my favorite method to get your exposure, it can be relatively effective just to look at the back of the camera and see what the overall lighting and exposure looks like. But to do that, you have to actually be able to see your screen. One thing you can do to help with that, down here, back on this yellow tab, number 7, which is monitor. Under monitor brightness, you're going to change that to sunny weather from manual. It's going to brighten up the screen a lot and help you, especially when you're in sunny weather, be able to actually see what your exposure looks like. Screen on this camera isn't amazing, so you still might be challenged there, but it is going to help nonetheless. That sunny weather option is going to maybe drain your battery a tiny bit faster, but it's negligible and I think it's completely worth it. There are way more reliable methods of getting exposure than looking at the back of the screen, but nonetheless, that can be, again, relatively effective. Next, when it comes to white balance, that's the colors and tones of your shot. That's a big one to make sure that you get right. Your camera is going to come out of box in this auto white balance setting, and that's fine. It does a pretty good job. If you take a bunch of photos in the exact same scene, what you might notice is that the white balance shifts a little bit from photo to photo, which can be a little bit annoying when you're trying to create consistency. One thing you can do to help that, I'm back in this customize settings option, so operation customize. We're going to map a button to a specific option. Let's just take the first one here, that trash can, just for the sake of conversation. We're going to map that. We're going to go to this color and tone. We're going to go to white balance. I'm going to go to auto white balance lock toggle. Now what's going to happen when your camera has to be in auto white balance to work, but you're going to let the camera get the white balance of the scene for 10 to 15 seconds. And then when you tap that trash can button, because we just mapped it there, you're going to see that auto white balance lock turn on. That just means that the white balance will not change at all until you untoggle it, and now the camera is constantly going to be trying to manipulate for the right white balance. But being able to lock that might help you a ton when you're trying to create consistency within the exact same scene, the exact same lighting conditions. If you change lighting or change scene at all, I would unlock that and just repeat that entire process. I don't use auto white balance because even though the camera does a pretty good job, it doesn't do a perfect job, and I've learned how to set that manually. It's actually pretty easy. So if your photos aren't turning out exactly how you want them to look, you might need to level up with your ability to manually set your exposure and your white balance. And it's a lot easier than you might think. And it's even easier when you have systems like these to help you get dialed in. Which one are you gonna watch first? Oh, the good news, they're both using Sony cameras, so the menu items are gonna look really similar to your Sony ZV E10 II. I'll see you in the next video. Take care. See ya.